Lep pozdrav iz
Good morning from Slovenia. Welcome to today's conference on the future of cross-border cooperation. First, a technical announcement regarding interpretation. Today, you can listen and speak English, French, Dutch, Spanish, Slovenian, and Croatian. Good morning again. Welcome to the conference on the future of cross-border cooperation. This conference is organized at the right moment, in my opinion, because it will contribute to the COR's position on the future of Europe debate. So I'm looking forward to today's discussions on the way we see our common future. The internal border regions cover 40% of the EU's territory, and they account for about 30% of the population, which means about 150 million people. These regions also host almost 2 million cross-border commuters. I come from Slovenia, and all regions, apart from the central region in my country, are border regions. Since the creation of the single market, border regions have become places of growth. And even though these regions have faced progress, they are still facing some difficulties. Difficulties in terms of access to healthcare, commuting, and they're facing administrative problems as well. Similarly, businesses face obstacles that hamper their growth. Local and regional authorities are experiencing challenges in establishing deeper cross-border cooperation, for example, in the field of cross-border public services. We have faced significant setbacks in these areas due to COVID-19. During the crisis, the existing problems that the citizens face in border regions have become even greater. Closing down borders meant that different sectors suddenly found themselves in a very difficult position. Some sectors are facing potential collapse. After decades of open borders, we saw difficulties with traveling, and some economic activities ceased almost altogether. However, we were also witness to the incredible resourcefulness and solidarity between our citizens. People living in border areas have faced difficulties, but cross-border cooperation is essential for their livelihoods. It is important to overcome cross-border obstacles. It's important that cross-border cooperation continues despite crisis conditions. The purpose of today's conference is to discuss the effects of the pandemic on cross-border cooperation and how these experiences can help us shape our common future. The COR last week adopted the resolution on the future of cross-border cooperation, based on the information obtained from this region during the last year. In addition, we have prepared several studies on this topic. This resolution will serve as a contribution to the debates at the conference on the future of Europe and will strengthen cross-border cooperation. The COR would like to call on other EU institutions and member states of the European Union to never again allow that border regions or the everyday lives of citizens be impacted the way they were during this crisis. We need to find solutions that will provide an effective answer to the crisis. An important aspect of our work leading to the adoption of this resolution were the consultations in preparation of the resolution. They ran for about 3 months, and 340 cross-border regions contributed to it. The consultations led to some very interesting but not surprising conclusions. The main conclusions, where we were almost unanimous, were that there are still obstacles that make the lives of our citizens harder, that make it harder for businesses to function. Transport and connectivity remain the biggest obstacles. We are also facing another important barrier in terms of cross-border cooperation. We've talked about it several times already. It pertains to the national legislations that are not harmonized. In addition, the experience gathered during the pandemic has shown that the mechanisms that we dispose of currently are not sufficient to tackle any sort of crisis on a larger scale. So these are the topics we will be discussing today. The conference on the future of Europe is the opportunity for further debates with citizens regarding the priorities of the European Union, and cross-border cooperation should become a priority in the future. Border regions will play a key role in the development of healthcare, an important role in the fight against climate change and environmental challenges. This can contribute to the economy that works for people, can lead to social fairness, equality, and intergenerational solidarity. I am pleased that today, when we are creating a cohesive and sustainable vision for cross-border cooperation in Europe, to be able to welcome you, European citizens from all corners of the Union, at today's conference. Before we start with the first debate, I would first give the floor to Mr. James Wesley Scott, the Professor of Regional and Border Studies at the Karelian Institute at the University of Eastern Finland in Joensuu. He is a specialist in cross-border cooperation. Mr. Scott, based on your experience, how do you see the future of cross-border cooperation? And, even more importantly, what will life look like in 2050 in cross-border regions? What do we need to focus on if we want to make sure that these areas are developmentally oriented and contribute to the overall development of the European Union as a whole? The floor goes to you, Mr. Scott.
Can you hear me?
Ja, slyším vás.
Excellent. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
I should open my presentation. Let's see. I'm trying to find. I sent my PPT, but if it's not going to be possible to open it, present.
We can present it from here, from Brussels, if you like. You just give me a sign.
Oh, wait a minute. I found it. Share. Here it is. And I just show the slideshow, and it should be working well now. It shouldn't. Okay. Many thanks for inviting me to address these two questions, which are, of course, immense. And I think that Mr. Jagar did a good job already enumerating some of the challenges and future prospects facing cross-border cooperation in Europe. So I will try to address these two questions by just briefly touching upon some of the issues that I think could be decisive. Number one, I do believe, and I'm just going to go very rapidly through this because I don't want to take up too much time, that the EU's commitment to cross-border cooperation is going to remain firm. And I think this is very important, very clear, because cross-border cooperation is part of the European Union geopolitical, internal identity as a force for change. And I think it would be very strange indeed for the European Union somehow to abandon this idea. I think this is, since the adoption of Interreg and other programs, very clear that cross-border cooperation is Europeanization and at the local level, at the regional level, and contributes to multi-level governance in a broader sense. And this commitment is, of course, clearly documented or evidenced by the increase of support, the material support, for example, in terms of the Interreg structural initiative, which has seen a massive increase of its budget. Of course, it's a very small amount of cohesion funds, but still, I think a very important element of cohesion funds. We have seen a progression of cross-border cooperation from the core areas of Europe, the so-called core, from the very beginnings of cross-border cooperation of the German-Dutch border, to a proliferation of cross-border cooperation all over the European Union and beyond. And we see, in fact, the marketing, the creative graphic design that goes with it, the image making aspects, which I think is not just trivial. I think it's quite important. This idea that cross-border cooperation is also a message. It's an announcement that we are being united by borders, and I think these maps are quite evocative of that spirit that the European Union embodies. And then we also have the local level, the very local level here, the Frankfurt Oder Subice, where we see the cross-border cooperation also working in micro conditions, in very interesting conditions of twin cities, or let's say cross-border partnerships at the local level. Now, so specifically to those questions, very difficult actually to answer. The future of cross-border cooperation, I tried to address it in terms of challenges that might make it more difficult in future for cross-border cooperation to flourish, both within the EU but also along the external borders. And what are some of the issues that might be specifically important to address attention to? Number one, I think, is the potential danger that the opportunity structures, the instruments with which cross-border cooperation is financed, become more complex and more complicated to use because of greater centralization, thematic centralization that could, I have no idea if this will be the case, but that could limit, let's say, the ability of local and regional actors to use it for specific cross-border targets. So loss of flexibility in the use of Interreg and other funds. One problem I do see is the local government level, which needs to be empowered, needs to have resources, needs to be able to act in terms of providing services, in terms of representing local communities, in order to create a sense of cross-border community. And if local governments are disempowered, if we see a centralization of all sorts of municipal activities and duties, this could also be a problem for CBC, especially at the local level. These are kind of administrative issues that I think are quite important, but other than that, we also have the problem of regional development challenges. Number one, the demographic challenges, shrinking, aging, the fact that the European Union is consolidating population around core areas and metropolitan areas, and that border regions do count to some of the more peripheral areas in the European Union, and this will be a future challenge. Definitely, it's already a challenge. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with the emptying out of rural areas, of the semi-rural periphery, if you want, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but the non-metropolitan areas, which oftentimes are not border regions, they can be, but oftentimes they are not. How to deal with that? What we do find from the literature is that there's a persistence of legal and administrative barriers, despite all the momentum of European integration and Schengen and other arrangements that bring the member states together. But here in the level of the legal frameworks, that impact on labor markets, on health services, on public transportation, on institutional cooperation, also linguistic questions of communication can play an important role in, or a negative role, let's say, in making cooperation more difficult. And at the external borders, I would add, in addition to these problems, geopolitics. The geopoliticization, it's a terrible word, I know, but this is something that has really affected the European neighborhood policy. And the EU should not lose its nerve. It should continue with its commitment to Ukraine and Moldova and other areas at the external borders, but at the same time be very cognizant of the geopolitical hazards, dangers that could, I'm not going to name names, but I think we know what I'm talking about. But this is another, I would say, another important challenge that has to be dealt with. Now, to the future, where will we be, let's say, at the year 2050 in terms of CBC, cross-border cooperation? And I will wager that cross-border cooperation will, more than it is now, be part of everyday governance routine. So it will be
We cannot hear you, Mr. Scott. Can you help me from the technician?
Mr. James, your mic seems to be off. We see your presentation, but we don't hear you or see you.
that is.
Yeah. We just.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
The minute I started sharing, I guess something happened. So I hope you've heard at least some of what I said.
We kind of stopped at the beginning of this slide.
At this slide,
yeah.
Sure. Okay, thank you for. So I will just finish with the future of cross-border cooperation. I think one of the main challenges that we have to think about is the fact that there are great disparities between different border regions. We have the cross-border functional urban regions. We know that are motors of growth, la Grande Région, Eurozone region. We have even the Vienna, Bratislava, Győr situation, but many border regions are in fact lagging. dealing with very severe economic challenges, and we have to, especially at eastern borders, and find new mechanisms of dealing with these issues. I think that at the same time, in terms of the future, I think much has been achieved. Much has been achieved. One of the reasons, one of the proofs of this is the fact that we're sitting together discussing these issues at the conference about the European future of the European Union. But the cross-border cooperation will still need to continue efforts to increase its political voice and influence. It's a very important aspect of integration, of European integration. It doesn't really get that much attention. It doesn't get that much visibility, and that is something that by 2050, I would think, has changed as well. Okay, I was sorry. Many thanks for your attention. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened, that my mic got switched off, but I hope that you were able to more or less follow my arguments. Thank you.
Hvala, gospod Scott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. Thank you for your presentation. And now, I suggest we go to the first panel. I suggest we tackle the lessons learned during the COVID-19 crisis. Like I mentioned before, the answer to COVID-19 crisis was the closure of borders in several cases. And this meant that many citizens and businesses in many regions suddenly found themselves in a very difficult position. Border regions were faced with massive impacts at the economic and social levels. The current crisis has resulted in the biggest setback in these regions in the last decades. It has emphasized the obstacles that European citizens face in their daily lives. It has underlined them. During this panel, we will look at the experience of the border regions during the pandemic and the lessons learned, how they tackled the obstacles, and we will talk about the lessons learned as well. I would like to start with Mr. Gian Pieroni, the director of the Transfrontier Operational Mission, which was set up by the French government in 1997. Before that, he was director of MOT at the DG Regio in the Urban Development, Territorial and Cohesion Unit. Mr. Pieroni, you have worked extensively with the MOT and you have monitored the experiences and the effects on the citizens during the pandemic, on citizens in cross-border regions, that is. You have worked on a report that is very topical, so I would like to ask you to present the main findings. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I go on. Well, thank you. I will base my presentation on the study we made for the DG Regio. So please, next slide. This study refers to spring 2020, so the first wave of the pandemic. It was performed on all internal land borders of EU. It is based on 21 interviews, and it also involved the network of MOT, but also the network of ABR and CESCI. And the four main tasks have been to map the border measures taken, to see the impact on the cross-border communities. So we did 20 case studies. We tried to explore the role of the cross-border structures, and we drew some lessons and recommendations. And I will now focus on these lessons and recommendations. Next slide, please. First at the local level, and then at the other levels, which are obviously the state level and the EU level, within the multi-level governance. And I insist on the fact that these lessons are important for crisis management, but they are also valid for the recovery and beyond, because all the crisis reinforced what the stakeholders already told before the crisis. Next slide, please. So basically, yes, please, yes, okay, thank you. Basically, it's obvious that all regions in the world suffered, but cross-border regions suffered double penalty. And when borders were suddenly closed, persons were hurt as economic actors, such as cross-border workers, because mobility was drastically limited. Persons were hurt as users of cross-border public services, because they were the first to be interrupted. They were hurt as citizens, because suddenly there were only national citizens. The restrictions on borders were based on ID cards, and suddenly the EU citizenship had disappeared. They were hurt as informed persons because there was no more cross-border information. They were hurt as also persons inspired by culture, by ethics, because suddenly the border was back and the persons crossing borders were considered as strangers. And they were hurt as persons engaged in couples, in families, because sometimes families were divided by the border. And I would also say that after the border closure, persons reacted first and not institutions. But existing cross-border governance showed the way. When it was possible, diplomats, local politicians, local civil servants could find a way to react through cross-border governance. And this is important to remind that we need institutions also in the cross-border context. Next slide, please. So, lessons from the bottom up. Please start from cross-border life of persons with all its dimensions, not only economic. Within their cross-border communities, consider borders as living areas rather than lines. Prefer a functional approach rather than institutional, vertical, bureaucratic approach, and give local authorities, give EGTCs or equivalent structures a more prominent role to manage borders. More specifically, next slide, where can these EGTCs act? They can act for cross-border users of public services, build and maintain cross-border public services in case of crisis, and it would be useful to establish an EU framework for this. You can obviously refer to Mr. Pavel Branda's report. We have also to address cross-border citizens and to ease persons and families' border crossings. We should think of a cross-border citizen status. Why not cross-border living area conventions? There I quote things that diplomats are studying now on some French borders. So it's happening already to develop new solutions. Then we need to provide cross-border communities with permanent democratic cross-border councils. It is beginning on some borders, but the crisis has shown that we need to address communities permanently with more democracy. We have to address cross-border workers, consumers, businesses. They have the right to live across the border, and for that we need to develop cross-border information centers. We need to have better informed citizens through local cross-border observatories, delivering harmonized cross-border data with the support of national and EU level. And we need also to consider inspired citizens with their ethic, their commitment. And for that, we need to fund people-to-people projects to build trust or to rebuild trust that has been damaged during the crisis. Of course, when they exist, EGTCs should be on the forefront to manage these solutions. Next slide, please. It's not only about local action, it's also about state and EU action. During the crisis, most problems came from lack of state coordination across the border. National level also matters to manage crisis and recovery. In crisis context, states have legitimacy to limit mobility, but they should coordinate horizontally and vertically with their local authorities and across the border. We need sovereign states with their legal and funding capacity. But sovereignty means nothing if states don't act together. And obviously, EU was there from the beginning. It did what it could within a limited mandate, but it is obvious that there is room to increase its intervention. The EU in the future should check that state action is fair and proportionate, which it wasn't during the crisis, and EU should be present to provide more information and more coordination. Next slide, please. It means that the recommendations that we can give is increase EU competence on health policy. I would say that for the moment, the communication is a little bit disappointing, and we should think about harmonizing crisis management from the EU level and considering borders and include the need to have cross-border emergency plans. We also need to reinforce bottom-up cross-border multi-level governance with 3 levels. The 3 levels are important. Cross-border regions, of course, but states and EU. At the national level, you need to have coordination of each border. You need to adapt legislation. You need to develop cross-border impact assessment procedures. There are different models to act. You can act on bilateral level, such as the French-German border with the Aachen Treaty, which was signed before the crisis, which allowed to adapt, to improve the coordination. There are other options. There are multilateral options like Nordic Council, like what the Visegrad countries do. But in any case, European level have to coordinate that, have to provide help. Interreg is obviously and will be very helpful with the new devices such as integrated territorial approach, strengthening of cross-border governance. Certainly, Mr. Tokarski will say things about that. But we need also to adopt the ECBM regulation. Amended or not, I don't know, but we need certainly to, in the future, to establish not only national or regional cross-border coordination points, but also to make that they act within a network, coordinated, monitored by the EU border coordination point. We really need to have these 3 levels working together. Last slide, please. I will now conclude. Cross-border regions deserve EU special attention. It's in the treaty, since Lisbon Treaty, because of their handicaps, obstacles, closure of borders, because of their potentials, because when the border is fully open, there is still much potential. The crisis has revealed cross-border interdependencies. This requires new policies, functional approach, considering persons in their cross-border living areas, not only economic actors, not only national citizens, not only users of public services, but also persons that are inspired, that are committed, that are aware, and that are families and couples and human persons. I will invite you to join the European Cross-Border Citizens Alliance that has been forged between Committee of the Regions and already a number of stakeholders. I would invite you to build cross-border contributions to the Conference on the Future of Europe. And I will remind that the ever-closer union of the peoples of Europe happens in cross-border regions. It's not only about just managing the crisis now, it's about thinking of the future, thinking of 2050, and this ever-closer union of the peoples of Europe has to happen, and it will happen also, and perhaps on the first row, in cross-border regions. Thank you for your attention.
Hvala, gospod.
Thank you, Mr. Peroni, for your presentation. Moving on in our discussion, I would like to welcome Mr. Slavomir Tokarski, who is a director in DG Regio, working on cross-border cooperation. In the past, he also worked in DG Mare, and he was also nominated head of unit dealing with the economic policy and coordination of EU funding. Mr. Tokarski, from the beginning of the pandemic, DG Regio has been cooperating very fruitfully with the Committee of the Regions and the European Cross-Border Citizens Alliance. And your DG has also commissioned a study that was presented by Mr. Peroni. Now, experience learned based on these studies and gained in general, lessons learned, all of this can be used for cross-border cooperation in the future as well. So what is your view on this? What can we expect from the European Commission with regard to cross-border cooperation in the future? Mr. Tokarski, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this introduction. And I will try to reply to the questions that you posed, but maybe if we start with next slide, please. I would like a little bit to start with two ideas which we use to tell the story of border regions. And first, which seems maybe obvious, border regions are champions of European integration. And they are the champions of European integration because this is in the border regions where the impact of integration, where the impact of free movement of people, of goods, is felt in everyday interactions and in every aspect of people's life. It is also where the obstacles are most impactful, as we heard from the preceding speaker, and which we saw when member states introduced different barriers which disrupted the variety of interactions that were linking people across the border. But also maybe something that is less obvious is that the reasons that for the same reasons as they are the champions of European integration, border regions can also act as a sort of living labs or hotspots for new innovative ideas that are regarding European integration. So if something works in the border region, it would also work elsewhere, and there is often the situation that the first need emerges there in the areas that are adjacent to borders. So if we move to the next slide, yes, I think we tend to forget that the border regions are not just a small minority of European population. It is 30%, and they live on 40% of European territory. And strangely enough, the more populated and the more socioeconomically advanced the border areas, the more challenges and difficulties they encounter in interacting. At first sight, it seems to be counterintuitive, but it is fully verified by empirical work. And it has, of course, a certain logic, which is that the more you engage with the others, the more questions you need to resolve together. So if you turn your back on someone, you do not need to agree on anything. But if you engage, you need to talk, you need to negotiate, and you need to act. So simply put, one needs to discuss much more issues with a close friend than with a bystander, because the former is much important to him or to her. Now, at the same time, border regions are the places where most of what we are trying to build together as Europeans takes a very concrete shape. Single market, freedom of movement of workers, single currency, education area, research area, you name it. So all those projects come to live and thrive in cross-border regions if they are not disturbed by the existing obstacles. And again, interestingly enough, if you look at the map, what it shows is that there is a huge gain to be obtained from removing existing border obstacles in the EU and turning border regions into functional areas. The darker the color, the greater the economic growth gains, which altogether account for almost 2% of GDP. If we now look at the next slide, let's maybe first think about what are the assets of border regions. And one of them, which is often forgotten, is that in border regions, borders are crossed every day by more than 2 million workers in the European Union, probably much more. And this is an interesting example of how regions and territories that are adjacent to border can actually combine competitive advantage on both sides, also leading to greater cohesion, as with the movement of workers, the salaries tend to converge. There are also many natural assets, rivers, woods, coasts that are shared between border regions, and the cultural diversity, which allows border regions to offer very attractive and diversified tourist experience, which is concentrated in a relatively small area. But there are also shared risks and disasters, such as floods and fires, and you might remember a couple of years ago the accidental Tisha river pollution, which spilled into neighboring countries, or large forest fires in Portugal and Spain. But so far, it has been the pandemic that has been the most challenging crisis. We saw it when, for the first time in decades, many border crossing points were closed simultaneously across the EU. It came to the border population as a sort of shock. In a way, they saw that in a couple of days, all the gains, all the progress they made over the last decades have been somewhat annulled. And then clearly there is a very long list of those negative effects, and we heard about them from Mr. Perron. But I think on the positive sides, we have also to recognize that there were many acts of human solidarity that were demonstrated by inhabitants of one border regions towards those living on the other side. And that's something very important and very encouraging. And it also something that reminds us that cross-border cooperation is not only about economics, it is also about trust, empathy, and overcoming stereotypes, needed today maybe more than ever. So next slide, please. So we have to ask ourselves how we make sure that what we saw in recent months do not happen again, so that we do not have this automatic reflex of closing our borders when there will be another crisis. We also need to think how we can more and in a better way exploit and capitalize on creativity and diversity of border regions, because this is also the very important asset that they have. And how we can really empower and enable this growing together and interactions, more joint thinking, more coordination. In the Commission, we want to continue working on three main pillars. First, on multi-level governance, and I think we heard quite a lot about it. So we need really to reflect on how we support long-term, genuinely cross-border cooperation across Europe. And this is, as we've seen, is not about bringing neighbors closer to each other, but it's equally important to ensure that border regions have the access to national decision makers and establish a sort of long-term dialogue. because the hasty decisions that were taken by member states and that impacted so badly on border regions were often the result of the lack of this contact between border regions and national decision makers, and lack of the perception of what those new barriers can actually cause for the population of border regions. Now we have the obstacles, and we need really to work on them. This is the heart of our action, and we must really be able, together with the regions, together with the member states, to remove the majority of border obstacles that practitioners identify and share with us. And those obstacles pop up in most sectors of daily cross-border life, in transport, in health, in education, in employment, or in energy. So indeed, as speakers that spoke before me mentioned, we must become much better at resolving those issues at the most appropriate level, which sometimes is European legal framework, but more often it is in national legislation or administrative acts. Hence again, the importance of the access of border regions to national authorities. And finally, the financial support, the Interreg, new generation of Interreg programs. The programs are right now under preparation, and really we must make our best to ensure that these funds are used wisely and effectively for a sort of durable change. There is a new legislation which entered into force just last week on the 1st of July, and it contains a number of new innovative elements that we really hope to use and invest in the more strategic and structural changes in border regions. I think some of the speakers mentioned already new Interreg objective, cooperation governance, but also to a little bit reply to what Mr. Scott said about the fear of not being local enough, of central level prevailing over local level. We introduced, we put a lot of emphasis on small projects that need to be managed locally, on people-to-people projects, or community-led local development, which is precisely where local authorities can play a role. Next slide, please. Yes, and then we have a European cross-border mechanism, ECBM. Just to recall the story, you might remember that in 2018, Commission made a proposal that was welcomed by many of you, and I think we all really hope that this will be a game changer for those implementing cross-border projects. Now, unfortunately, it not yet materialized, and for the moment we are in the situation where the ECBM is actually stuck in the Council because the majority of the member states do not support further work on the regulation. So we need to reflect on what we do, but certainly we do not intend to let it go, in a sense that we all see that there is an issue. There is an issue which is very real, which is brought to us by practitioners, by the community of practitioners that we created, in particular with the B solutions mechanism. So far we identified 90 obstacles. So we need to find a way to create a mechanism that would allow us to resolve those obstacles within a single set of rules, and not two or three. Next slide, please. So for the moment, we keep the legal proposal on the table, and we continue working on the idea of such a mechanism. As I mentioned, we deeply believe that there is a real problem, and it is the task of the Commission to do something to address this problem. We also, in parallel, we want to continue this bottom-up work, which has been achieving very promising results, with the idea that the more obstacles we can identify, the more we can demonstrate that the potential of cross-border regions could be really fully used. If those obstacles are removed, the more we can make case also to the member states. We will further develop work based on B solutions, and we want to give further visibility also in the context of the conference on the future of Europe, because indeed it's a good occasion to talk about cross-border regions that where the borders actually links people rather than divides them. And I think in this context, we also want to work alongside the European Cross-Border Citizen Alliance to make the voice of border regions stronger in those ongoing debates about the future of Europe. And the initiators of this alliance are all with us today, so I would like to use this occasion to very much welcome the very good and constructive dialogue we have had them with them for years now. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea about where our thinking goes, we shall adopt officially a new Commission report that will be published on the 13th of July. And this report a little bit looks on one hand on lessons learned from COVID pandemic, and then also is trying to give a certain understanding of where the work will go in the near future. So after the first part, which is taking stock of what happened since the publication of the first report back in 2017, first communication, we are looking at the venues for action in the next years to come, and we identify 4 clusters where this action is supposed to take place. So deeper institutional cooperation. We heard a lot about coordination. There is no coordination without deepening institutional cooperation, without long-term approach of cross-border regions to joint work, to future resilience, to meeting jointly the challenges. We also want to look into more and better cross-border public services. We have seen how efficient was, for example, in those cases where we managed to remove the obstacles, how efficient it was cooperating in the framework of joint health infrastructure. We will be looking at cross-border labor markets, improving the access to jobs and recognition of qualifications. And finally, we will also see what European regions can do by working together on European Green Deal. So these are the major venues of our work. And again, with the idea that we learn from what happened, that in the future there is no, I think in the future really we act together because without coordination, if we have only individual decisions of the member state, this is making the situation of every region worse, and by acting together, by taking joint decisions, by preparing protocols for future pandemics if they happen, we can only gain. It is a win-win situation for every single border region. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hvala, gospod.
Thank you, Mr. Tokarski, for presenting the Commission's view and the plans of the Commission for the future. Moving on, Madam Arola Urdangarin, who is coming from a region along the French-Spanish border. She is the director of the EGTC, Euroregion Nouvelle-Aquitaine, Euskadi, Navarra. Madam Urdangarin, your Euroregion was very active even before the pandemic. You've been dealing with many issues of great importance for the citizens of this Spanish-French Euroregion. You've had to adapt very quickly, strengthen your efforts, and we would like to hear what your experiences have been so far. Madam Urdangarin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Slavin, I don't know if you can put my presentation on. Otherwise, I will do it. Thank you. Bueno, pues como aprovechando.
Well, I'll take advantage of the fact that we have translation into many languages, so I'll be giving my presentation in Spanish. So firstly, I'd like to thank the Commission and the Committee of the Regions for allowing us to come and explain to you what we've been doing over the last year and a half of the pandemic, this situation that has hit us all and in cross-border regions. Now, the question is, how have we adapted? What actions and measures did we have to implement to tackle the situation that we've been facing in our territory? So, just a recap. Our EGTC region straddles the French-Spanish border, and it covers Nouvelle-Aquitaine, and the Navarra and the Euskadi regions. So that's just to give you an idea. You see on the map here what territory we cover. I just wanted to divide my presentation into two different time periods. The first period, the first wave, if I can say, which is when the coronavirus crisis really began. That was between March and July last year, where borders were shut. And then there was a second period, a second wave, from September last year running through to, well, now, actually. Just a few weeks ago, things relaxed a bit, but basically it's taken that long. In the first wave, March to July last year, we all know that the borders were closed, and that had an impact for the cross-border regions. People couldn't move, transport couldn't move, there was no trade across the borders. And cross-border trade in our region is vital. I mean, 97% of the clients are on the other side of the border. So the closure of the border was dramatic for them. And the cross-border projects ground to a halt, and social and family ties across the border were also shut down. Our cross-border region had a lot of transport across the border. However, in the second wave, the border closure wasn't so strict, but there were still restrictions, and there were different restrictions either side of the border, and even between the two autonomous communities in Spain, we had very different restrictions, which basically meant that the rules either side of the border were very different, and they were ever changing. Rules changed the whole time. On the Spanish side, they were changing not only every week, but sometimes several times in 1 week. And it was very important to give information to the citizens so as to clarify things. People were uncertain. People were a bit afraid. Could they do this? Could they not do this? Under what circumstances could they cross the border? So, in the EGTC, we decided to carry out a series of actions to offset the measures, to make things a bit clearer for the cross-border population and to make life easier for them. So during the first period, the March to July 2020 period, our first efforts focused on ensuring the continuation of the cross-border projects that were underway, because that was very important. because we had a lot of projects underway. So we needed to adjust the mechanisms, adjust all the projects and the financing thereof, so that the partners of the projects could continue with the projects underway. And this was important because we had to try and come back to some kind of degree of normality in our border region. And this was also vital for cross-border workers. Let's not forget that during the period where the borders were closed, there were some border points that were shut altogether. A few were open, but with very, very long queues, because all the cross-border workers had to go through the same checkpoint, and it was pretty chaotic at these few open checkpoints. Now, France and Spain, unlike other border areas, did not issue any certification for the cross-border workers. So they didn't have this facility of proving that they were a cross-border worker so as to make it easier for them to get across. So what we try to do is to help the cross-border workers, inform them how they should get across. And we went through this almost on a case-by-case basis, looking at the specific characteristics of the workers. There were some cross-border workers who had to know about the certification they needed, basically trying to tackle their problems almost on a case-by-case basis. So basically, we collated all the information to pass it on to them to make their life a bit easier. I mean, even though cross-border life had almost ground to a halt. When the strict lockdown ended and different member states announced their measures to return to normality, opening up after lockdown, then we saw that the cross-border areas were not included in these lockdown relaxation plans. And we had some doubts. Would the cross-border areas be included in these plans, the recovery plans for the member states? So we carried out several actions, especially thanks to the president of the Euro region, getting them to lobby with the two member states, France and Spain, so as to take the cross-border reality into account in their lockdown relaxation plans. So what we wanted to do was see what the actual impact had been on the cross-border population and on the cross-border workers, what the impact of the lockdown and the border closure had been. So we asked them what had happened over the few months. And of course, we wanted to be fairly quick because we wanted to get some results so that then we could show on the basis of the results that the borders really need to be opened up. We had about 2,500 answers over the 10-day period of the survey because we needed to give those people a voice for them to be heard. So we launched this survey and we drew up a report on the impact that COVID had on the region as a result of the border closure. So that's basically what we did in the first wave. We wanted to raise awareness with the cross-border population and help them, provide them with information. Now, in the second period, the second wave, as I said, from September 2020 onwards, what we had to do was constantly inform people of the restrictions on either side of the border. because I said in Spain, each autonomous community had its own restrictions as well. And sometimes, the people were just completely confused. So we came up with some kind of rundown of all the measures in Aquitaine, Navarra, Euskadi, and we were updating this information constantly, again, to make things easier. And this was not only helpful for the population, but also for the press as well, for the media, because they didn't know what was happening. There seemed to be some kind of legal vacuum. I mean, the borders weren't closed, but there was a vacuum of information. Could they cross and under what conditions? So we've been drawing up this list of information and updating it every week. So we had to work very hard to do all of this. And at the same time, on a day-to-day level, we were answering dozens of phone calls and emails sent in by people who are asking us, well, am I allowed to do this? Am I not allowed to do that? I can cross the border, but I don't know. As of previous speakers have said, they were worried that perhaps the borders would close again. So basically, that's the sort of work that we've been doing during this second wave. And here, I would like to focus on the conclusions that we drew from the survey and the report that was drawn up. What I need to underscore is that about 65% of the cross-border population crosses a border for personal or socioeconomic reasons. So there's a significant catchment area where people cross the border, not for work necessarily, but for social reasons, to see family, and all of that had ground to a halt. So the impact was really quite significant for the cross-border workers. About nearly 70% of the respondents in the survey had told us that their life had been very or significantly affected by the closure of the borders. So yes, there was a clear significant impact. About 90% of cross-border citizens had stopped working on the other side of the border. And there was also a percentage of these people have decided they're not going to go back to working on the other side of the border because they were afraid of the situation changing again. So we're going to have to think hard, because these sort of situations make it more difficult to have cross-border cooperation. But one very positive thing that came out of the report was that nearly all, 90% of the respondents to the survey said that cross-border cooperation and cross-border structure were essential if we are to continue the cohesion of our territory. Let me give you an idea of the priority actions that they wanted us to carry out, because we were asking them, what do you think is a priority for cross-border cooperation in our territory? And the answers were, we want to resume our cross-border economic activities, sports activities, cultural activities, cross-border activities for the youngsters. It gave us an idea of what the expectations of the cross-border workers are. The activities that were hardest hit, as I said, were trade, sales, as well as personal activities, visiting families. We had families and even couples that were separated. But of course, the socioeconomic impact has been the hardest. And also, there's this degree of uncertainty that people have now uncertainty about what's going to happen with the borders, and especially, I mean, of course, even though today the cross-border checks aren't exactly what they were last year. And then to conclude, what have we seen after the crisis? We've seen that we absolutely have to reinforce cross-border cooperation. We need to have better coordination between member states and administrations, and especially with the cross-border public administrations. The local administrations, as Jean was said, it's a bottom-up approach that is absolutely vital, because it's those of us who work on the ground know what the needs are. And we are in the best position to come up with the necessary solutions. But we need coordination between the member states as well as keeping into account the legal and financial framework of what we do. Looking at French-Spanish cooperation, it is vital that we should update the double taxation convention that exists between the two countries. So to conclude, and Jean Pieroni said this as well, we mustn't do this sort of thing only in crisis situations. These are the actions that we should implement in normal times as well. I think we're all learning by doing. And as we come back to a greater normality, we need to continue working and boosting cross-border cooperation. Because at the end of the day, that's what the people themselves want. So that's all I wanted to say. The last slide then, just to conclude. Thank you, everyone, and thank you also to the institutions, to Martin, Arfe, and our neighboring Euro regions, the ABR, working together to resolve the problems at a local level, but thank you also to the European institutions for helping us with this cooperation. Thank you.
Hvala tudi vam, gospa.
Thank you as well. Thank you for presenting your experience, the difficulties you've encountered during the crisis in your area. Moving on. Next is Mr. François Hublet, who is a member of the Geopolitical Studies Group at the major European think tank, BLUE, the Electoral Bulletin of the European Union. You have worked on a very interesting study regarding the subsidiarity crisis management during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was about the Germany's federalist experiment in a cross-border perspective. I would like to ask you to present your findings, and we are also interested in what you propose for the future. The floor is yours, Mr. Hublet.
Hello, you have to press on the button speak to speak. You have the floor.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me now?
No?
Yes.
Okay, nice. Thank you very much. Je vais parler en français.
I'm going to speak French because we have interpretation today. Thank you very much, Mr. Zagar, for the introduction. As you said, I'm a member of the geopolitical study group, which was founded in the ENS. I am the first rapporteur. We issued a report in December 2020 on the impact of the crisis on cross-border zones, the COVID crisis. This is basically a think tank on subsidiarity, and Germany has worked in a very decentralized way, and so our report looks at cross-border regions around Europe to try to have a multi-level management of the crisis, which takes into consideration different lifestyle issues in cross-border areas. So when we think about subsidiarity, we think about this on the member state level, but basically subsidiarity is also something that has an impact on regions and municipalities, because some of the issues to be dealt with were very local, for example, healthcare issues and so forth. So what we saw during the pandemic, geopolitically and politically in the EU, was where there was a focus on the first wave, and that was the subject of our initial study. You did recall very well the lives of citizens in cross-border regions were very affected during the first wave. There were brutal ruptures, as it were, and in Luxembourg, there were some big changes, and there were huge gaps in responses. For example, if you look at Sweden and Finland. And so we saw the first wave and certain restrictions that were put into place and that are still in place. And there were three major policies. They were very difficult. There's a lack of subsidiarity. There was a closing of borders, which was only on the national level with no consultation on the regional level. The hospital sector really lacked individual initiatives. For example, regional presidents talking to somebody on the other side of the border to try to find the best way to provide effective care. And so the representatives in these areas were really not taken into consideration when taking decisions. Another problem, a major deficit, was political representation of cross-border citizens. There are some exceptions. For example, parliamentary representation between France and Germany, but that's pretty exceptional, and it has been lacking because these cross-border bodies rarely have true decision-making power within the context of taking care of crises such as COVID. And then the third deficit, which goes hand in hand with the first two, is lack of proper media coverage. We talked about cross-border issues, but there were only really specialized regional media that dealt with the nitty-gritty of cross-border issues in this context. And so, but then there were some positive issues. For example, the Euro regions. The Euro regions were true coordination platforms, sharing of experiences, creating links, and they were real entry point for citizens who wanted to get information on the rules that would apply in one or another country. And so that's something that we saw in our study was, and this led us to have about 20 interviews in about 12 countries, and we got a global overview of these trends that really cover cross-border regions in Europe, generally speaking. And then on what are we going to do after the crisis in terms of cross-border cooperation, I think I'd like to give you three major points for this. First of all, one very positive thing on what the crisis taught us, the true interdependence and common life that we have. It was a very painful experience, but we did see that people lived together in many zones. There were common spaces. They were able to work directly together. But despite this, they were dependent on decisions taken at capitals, and the people on the spot were not able to take decisions for themselves. Second need that we pinpointed was to develop cross-border cooperation. Hitherto, cross-border cooperation was a long-term, medium-term issue, cultural and economic projects, but not urgent projects. And so when talking to stakeholders, we got the impression that there weren't really structures or resources to act operational in the face of a crisis such as COVID. And so there should be a development of cross-border cooperation to have something that's more institutionalized and more operational in order to be able to react to specific problems. And then thirdly, an important point that we saw was the vital importance of free movement. I never have seen the true need for free movement than I have over the past 2 years. We see that there's a certain inertia in Europe. There are certain restrictions on movement which are really quite major. So looking at the three developments that we pinpointed, common life, which is very visible, the need to have more cross-border cooperation, and the importance of freedom of movement, has led us to 4 proposals, which you will find in the report that we published in December last year, and which I'm going to present to you now. The first proposal, which is already something that is being implemented, it is to set up a European coalition of local and regional actors so that there's more subsidiarity in crisis management. Capacity to manage these issues is very important, but part of the responsibility really should be given to cross-border regions, and this is something that is very close to the resolution that the Committee of the Regions has published last week. And then also there are European citizens' initiatives for cross-border regions. This is something that we'd like to see develop, so that we can have more attention paid to cross-border issues. And then we need to work more on the upstream, on studies that will pinpoint in a much clearer way the needs of cross-border regions so that we can have better crisis management plans. We really need to know which are the relevant territories. We need to pinpoint transport flows, interdependence between different zones, economically speaking, and in order to do, and this is very important in order to have a crisis plan established so that there will be a national plan for these territories, and these large-scale surveys will be able to help us to pinpoint some of these major issues, and this is going to be a focal point for research in the coming years. And then, of course, the cross-border regions and GeoCities should be given a more heightened place. There's a need for the national states, when they take decisions to close borders, to really consult these areas beforehand, before these decisions are taken, and maybe give them some days' notice before the borders are closed, because this is something that will involve the cross-border regions in the decision-making and will help them better implement the decisions that are taken. And then our fourth proposal is a suggestion on the European level to have a coordination instrument for the management of inter-regional and cross-border crises. In Germany, there is a conference of minister presidents. That's an interesting body, and they played the role of coordinating the federal regions and working with the federal level to have better coordination. So this type of structure could be implemented on the European level. We could create an 11th form of the committee, the Council of Europe, and there could be a delegate from the Committee of the Regions there, and that could provide information directly from the members of the committee. And this is something that could be done to help manage future crises, learning from the COVID crisis, and this will allow for better coordination of cross-border policies across the European Union. So there's the constitution of local actors, pinpointing the needs of cross-border areas, looking at cross-border competencies, and then having a body to coordinate all of this. This is something that we'd like to see implemented in order to have a better cross-border cooperation in Europe. Thank you very much for the invitation. You will find the report in French, German, and English on the Geopolitical Study Group website. I can send the link to anyone who may be interested. And just a final word. We believe that the COVID crisis is a major opportunity to have more institutionalization of cross-border areas that really should be decision-making areas for the people who live in those areas and who are a wonderful community in these different cross-border regions. Thank you very much.
Hvala tudi gospodu Hublet.
Thank you, Mr. Ruble, and thank you for your presentation. And now, the last speaker during this panel, Mr. Gyula Oczkaj, the Secretary General at the Central European Service for Cross-Border Cooperation. And since its foundation in 2009, you have been the body's Secretary General. You have closely been monitoring cross-border cooperation, notably around Hungary and in Central and Eastern Europe as well. What are your experiences regarding the epidemic? How do you see the situation? How should we tackle any such crises in the future, taking into account, of course, that the current crisis is far from over? The floor is yours.
Well, Mr. Jagar, and thank you very much for inviting me to this prestigious conference. I'm very happy to be here. And as far as I can see, the consequences of the pandemic and the closures emerged due to the pandemic are very similar in different parts of Europe. I would like just to add three small comments which can better describe the specific components what we experienced in Central Europe. The first component is about the communist past. Many generations have been growing up in Central Europe in a world characterized by closed borders, strict border checks, and very often humiliating procedures when crossing the borders. So it was a very bad experience of the past, which created a general fear of border crossing in Europe. And Ms. Urdangarin mentioned that the people living in France and Spain were a bit afraid of crossing the borders during the pandemic. Now, I can tell you that we are working on a comprehensive report regarding the impacts of the pandemic on the borders in Central Europe, and we conducted several interviews. And one of our interviewees told us that many of her relatives and friends had decided to leave Ukraine because the older generations were terrified of the feeling that something very bad from the past returns now, and they experienced the closed borders during the Soviet Union, and now they felt that the separation created by the ceilings will generate this similar events that they experienced during their previous life. So I think that it is a very important message that these older generations experienced very similar separation and closure what they had experienced before during the communist past. And the newer generations acquainted their first experience on closed borders during the pandemic. And I think that this is a new phenomenon for them, but I can tell you that it is a general or common idea that or opinion in Central Europe that we would like to avoid border closures in the future. So it's a very strong wish of the local people, the border people, in the territory of post-communist countries, and it might be the more important motivation why even in countries like Hungary and Poland, where the Euro-pessimistic discourse is very strong, the people are still very favor of the European project, because the open borders mean something very positive for them, and maybe the main message of the European project is that the borders are open. So the first lesson learned from this pandemic in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, I think that we wouldn't like to return to the past. We would like to keep the borders open. The second some kind of conclusion of the experiences gained during this pandemic is that we experienced similar uncoordinated measures, just like everywhere in Europe, but without deteriorating bilateral relations, which is very important, because compared to the migration crisis in 2015, we experienced that the national governments and politicians blamed each other, and permanent disputes occurred about who made bad decisions and who is the main factor of the mistakes made during this migration crisis. During the pandemic, we didn't experience the similar events, and I think it's a very important and positive message. I don't know the reasons of this change, but the first lesson might be one of these reasons, that we experienced the closed borders and we wouldn't like to be closed again. And another factor might be that these border regions in Central and Eastern Europe are much less integrated compared to the Benelux countries or France and Germany or the Nordic countries. So these ties were not so integrated that the closures could impact upon the daily life of the people so deeply than in Western Europe. And some examples, what did it mean in practice? So in mid-March, the countries closed their borders, first between Italy and Slovenia, and after that Austria and Italy, Austria and Slovenia, Hungary and Slovenia, and so on. These border closures had their own consequences. First of all, many people who are working in Western European countries and whose factories were closed down wanted to return to their home country. But due to the ceiling, they couldn't cross the border between Germany and Austria and Hungary, and so on. So right after the closures, a humanitarian corridor has been set between Austria and Romania, Austria and Ukraine, Austria and Serbia, in order to allow the free movements of these returning workers to Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Bosnia, and so on. The second consequence was that many cross-border commuters were deprived from free movement, and it caused problems, for instance, in the social and health service system of Austria. Because the people who are working there are coming from the Czech, the Slovak, the Hungarian side, and they had to be allowed to cross the border. And due to this situation, during April, the end of March and April, the borders have been opened for cross-border commuters based on a local border traffic rule, which means that from a distance of 30 kilometers, the commuters were allowed moving freely for the time span of 24 hours. Or, for instance, during the parliamentary elections taken place in Romania in December, the borders between Hungary and Romania were open in order to allow the free movement of the voters. So the second lesson learned might be that every problem has to be addressed based on the principle of good neighborliness and the needs of cross-border citizens. And I think it's a very important message. And based on this, let me mention some positive examples, because after having a shocking experience during this pandemic, which fundamentally changed our behavior, our territorial behavior across the borders, I think that we should highlight those positive examples which may give back the trust of the local people in the European project. This would be the human face of cross-border cooperation, which is called by Henk van Houtum as the people approach in geographic cross-border research studies. And I think that if we can concentrate on the positive examples, then we can overcome the failures, what we experience now with the ECBM proposal. Because we have to speak about the border people, about the troubles made by the pandemic to the local citizens. I think that the main mission of the European project is to make the everyday life of the citizens better. So, for instance, we have some 15,000 Slovakian people living in Hungary. They are cross-border residential citizens who are moving every day from the urban functional zone of Bratislava and Košice to the two Slovakian cities and towns, and they were not registered in Hungary. They moved just to Hungary in order to find a more economic way of living. And after the measures taken by the two governments, prescribing that you have to have a residence card and a job certificate in order to cross the border, they realized that they are not allowed to cross the border. And in a couple of days, they were provided with the Hungarian residence card in order to enable them to move. Or stronger solidarity was experienced between the employers and the employees in the context of the Hungarian-Austrian border, where more than 100,000 Hungarian people are moving across the border in order to get to their job. And these people were weekly testing for free. They were provided with a Kurzarbeit system, which means that they were paid for their work which hasn't been done, and the employers had a permanent contact with them in order to not to lose the employees after the termination of the of the pandemic. Serbia shared vaccines with Croatia and North Macedonia. I think it is again a very good example how solidarity can override the troubles made by the past. Or Hungarian doctors and nurses participated in the Slovak mass testing project. And let me mention one more thing, which is about the cross-border projects. As Ms. Urdangarin mentioned, the ceiling disrupted the implementation of these projects. The managing authorities, based on our experiences, were very flexible during this pandemic. They allowed to reallocate the budget, to organize the events online, and to postpone events which couldn't be organized online. But I think that this flexibility is needed on behalf of the Commission as well. For instance, the measures of the Coronavirus Response Investment Initiative should be prolonged. Similarly to the eligibility period of the programs, and it is a question if we can take seriously the key performance indicators of the programs after a pandemic. So I think that it is again a question that we should tackle in the next future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We are lagging behind slightly, but nevertheless, I would like to open the floor for debate if any of the members would like to pose questions to our panelists. I would, in that case, give you the floor for a minute. Would anyone like to take the floor? I don't see anyone raising their hand. So I would like to thank all the panelists again for their presentations during this first panel. I suggest we move on to the second panel on the future of cross-border cooperation. As we've mentioned before, the Committee of the Regions, together with its partners, made an effort to obtain as much feedback as possible from its partners. On the 2nd of July, we adopted a resolution on the future of cross-border cooperation, and my colleague, Pavel Branda, will briefly present this resolution. This resolution contains concrete proposals on how to strengthen cross-border cooperation and how to overcome such crises in the future. Then we will give the floor to other panelists who will be able to present their vision of the future of cross-border cooperation. First, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Pavel Branda, who is Vice Mayor of Radlo, and he comes from the Czech-German-Polish border. He's the rapporteur on cross-border public services and chair of the COR's interregional group on cross-border cooperation. In his functions, he has presented several opinions on relevant topics. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Branda to present the resolution.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Jagar, dear colleagues, dear friends. We have been discussing so far the pandemic situation and the lessons learned. I think it's been truly a great learning experience for cross-border cooperation. But I think you will agree with me that we had enough learning, and we hope that this learning will not continue in the fall. I grew up directly at the closed borders during communism, experiencing all its negative effects, and I have been involved in promoting cross-border cooperation basically my whole life. And this is why it was very disappointing to see the borders completely closed again during the first wave of the pandemic. During the second wave, the member states did not close the borders completely, but there are so many restrictions and conditions attached to crossing them that I think we're still far from the borders being entirely open. If we learned something from the pandemic, I think it is how fragile the achievements of corporations are, and that they should not be taken for granted. Another lesson for me was that it was the natural reaction of member states to close the borders and not cooperate. This happens when you're governed by fear, and we that are involved in cross-border cooperation, we know that fear is actually like a poison to cooperation. Therefore, there is a constant need to support the cross-border cooperation at EU level, and so also rebuild the trust. I think this is where the people-to-people projects can play and should play a key role. So my plea is to please keep them as simple as possible, using the existing long functioning structures. I think that the long interruption of people-to-people project caused by the pandemic should not be prolonged by new administrative requirements. You know, I hear many times people saying, I hope we will return very soon to the old normal. I hope that we will not. I see the pandemic as a chance to return to a world that would be better than before. And I think this is also the case with the much needed restart of cross-border cooperation. I think this is a unique chance to actually improve it after the pandemic. As it was mentioned, the COR monitored the effects of the pandemic, analyzed it, and now plans actively contribute to shaping a new, improved cross-border cooperation. We're planning also to play an active role in representing border regions and their citizens in the Conference on the Future of Europe. The Cross-Border Citizens Alliance was founded for this purpose. I would also like to recognize and commend the European Commission because for many years it tries to go beyond Interreg with all the cross-border review exercise, the analyzing of the obstacles, the B solutions, the proposal of ECBM regulation, now the study of COVID that was very well presented by Jean Perroni from the MOD, and also focusing on the cross-border public services. I think this is all great efforts that show that the cross-border cooperation is more than just the Interreg. We have carried out also, as the COR, a public consultation on the future of cross-border cooperation. Among the results are, for example, the need to improve the cross-border connectivity or access of citizens to cross-border public services. We've also asked for the obstacles, basically confirmed what the Commission has already analyzed before. And the COR has addressed these issues in its resolutions on the future of CBC that was already mentioned. It was adopted last week. Let me just now briefly share with you a few points from this resolution. I think the main one is that we call on the European Commission to actually present a proposal for maintaining cross-border cooperation and cross-border life in the event of EU-wide or regional-sized crisis like with the COVID. I think that this proposal should envisage that internal EU borders will be kept open, ensuring the free movement of people and the delivery of cross-border public services, and also guaranteeing the functioning of the single market and the Schengen area. It was mentioned, I think, by Jean Perroni already that this concept of cross-border citizen status, I think this is the way to go. We should explore this more. And this could be a solution to this. We also urge that there is a need for residents of EU border regions to get the quickest possible access to emergency services like fire departments, healthcare services. But I think we should also explore more the concept in the future of the functional living areas. With this is closely related the topic that was mentioned several times already, and the cross-border public services. I think there should be some EU policy framework to allow for their efficient establishment and management. And this can actually bring concrete results to the people living in border regions. One example can be just the creation of the EU digital cross-border service card that would reduce the administrative complexity and costs for cross-border service providers. And of course, there's an issue of the ECBM. We regret very much that the discussions in the Council did not bring the fruits, because we see as local and regional authorities great benefits. And I think there should be an instrument like this in the future. So we encourage the discussions on how it should look like, and maybe the Commission can come with another proposal. The COR can play, can host, for example, a discussion between member states, the local regional authorities, and the other institutions and stakeholders before we do that. But I think this instrument would really benefit cross-border cooperation, and it comes from experience and from the analysis of the obstacles. So I think we should not forget this path, and we should continue. There should also be an instrument for coordinating between member states during the transposition of EU directives to prevent the creation of new legal obstacles at borders, etc., etc. So there are several topics, but I think the main question is what do we do with these themes, and how do we push them through the conference on the future of Europe? We've discussed this already at the COR, and we think there should be some communication and lobbying strategy, if you will, that would define clearly how we will proceed within the conference. I hope that we will be successful in our efforts, our common efforts, to put the cross-border cooperation back at the heart of the cross-border, of the European integration project, because this is, I think, where it rightly belongs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to colleague Branda. Thank you for presenting the activities of our committee in this field. Thank you for presenting the resolution we adopted. Now, we would continue with Natasha Tramiszak, who is coming from a Croatian border region at the Hungarian-Serbian-Croatian border. Since 2020, she is Minister of Regional Development and EU Funds of the Republic of Croatia. And she is a specialist in project management for public, private and civil sector. Ms. Tramiszak, we would like to know how important cross-border cooperation for the Republic of Croatia is. What is your opinion on the future cooperation, cross-border cooperation? The floor is yours.
Hvala vam lijepo, poštovani predsjedavajući.
Thank you, Mr. Žagar. Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Ministry of Regional Development and EU Funds of the Republic of Croatia, I would like to greet you all, and I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to comment briefly on the opinions of the Republic of Croatia on the cross-border cooperation and the way in which EU funds can be used to that purpose. Also, I would like to briefly speak about some common challenges that we face and common objectives that I think we all want to achieve at the level of the European Union. When speaking about the Republic of Croatia, one has to say that we have a rather specific geographical position. Also, the shape of our country is rather specific. We have one of the longest continental borders, and especially when it comes to the external borders of the EU, 1,370 kilometers of border is shared with other countries. Some of those countries have already been mentioned: Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Montenegro. Given the shape and the position of our country, we have the possibility of participating in 13 cross-border programs, and 5 of them are focused on projects with neighboring countries. There are several regional and transnational ones. In the previous period, from 2014 to 2020, we placed a significant focus on cross-border cooperation. Some of the reasons have already been mentioned by previous speakers for our focus on cross-border cooperation. The challenges that these regions are facing are numerous, and they are very similar across the European Union. These regions are very often less developed than the rest of their country, and they also have specific needs, specific challenges when it comes to transport, when it comes to other needs that their citizens have. Very often these regions have a mixed population of citizens coming from both countries. And this is why they actually have to be tackled in a specific manner as well. Cross-border cooperation in Croatia yielded a number of projects. These projects were very beneficial to the country as a whole, but also to the areas in which they were implemented. In the past 8 years, 693 projects were contracted. And our experience were actually very positive, because cross-border cooperation indeed helped us to build capacity, and also it was very beneficial before we became members of the European Union, because it allowed us to get prepared for what was coming. The number of projects is quite big, and I've already mentioned how many there were. But this is not the only thing that is important. Also, the funds that are allocated to the projects are very important. And I'm sure that in the next programming period, these funds will be allocated to further strategic projects that will be geared towards bettering the quality of life of citizens in border regions. When it comes to some important objectives such as environmental protection, energy efficiency, access to health care, strengthening institutional capacities, especially when it comes to public services, facing challenges posed by natural disasters, all these are important areas in which cross-border cooperation is absolutely needed. And of course, we shouldn't really forget about partnerships that are formed through these projects. I would also like to add that cross-border cooperation is important for a balanced and sustainable development within member states, but also across the EU. Thank you.
Hvala gospod Tramšak za pogled iz.
Thank you, Ms. Tramšak, for presenting the Croatian point of view regarding cross-border cooperation. Moving on now, we're going to Germany. The next speaker is Heike Rapp. Since 2015, she is member of COR and state representative of Rhineland-Palatinate, and responsible for Europe, media and digital affairs in the federal government. Your region has a long-standing tradition of cross-border cooperation with all neighboring member states and good experience with different cross-border actors that exist on this territory, such as EGTCs and Euro regions. Where would you see a need for stronger cross-border cooperation along the German-French border? And based on your experience, what would be your proposals for cross-border cooperation in the coming years? The floor is yours, Ms. Raab.
You need to press the speak button.
Okay. Thank you very much for helping me. Hello, dear Ivan Sakar and dear all on the end of the digital devices. I'm so glad that I could share the time with you to speak over cross-border cooperation. And yes, I'm plenipotentiary in Rhineland-Palatinate, and as you pointed out, we have a long border to France, short to Luxembourg, because Luxembourg is a smaller country than France, and a border to Belgium. And for us, the cross-border cooperation, indeed, like Natasha said as well, it is so important for us in the daily life. It is sustainable for us, and we have a lot of projects in normal times. But in the pandemic situation, the COVID-19 pandemic, it made absolutely clear for us that especially in exceptional circumstances, we need a closer cooperation along our borders. And now, since September 2020, every Thursday we have a common video conference along the border between the France sanitary authorities with the prefect, between the government of Luxembourg and also our partners from Belgium. And we try to continue to improve cross-border coordination, to make it more effectively, to communicate restrictions. And but let me have a review what has happened. Because of the pandemic situation, it was in the first wave quite terrible on the border front in France. So sometimes the German borders were not entirely closed, but they were closed at certain very important crossing points. We have had strict controls that has the effect of closing borders, and this along the border to France and to Luxembourg. And we have certain villages and towns which were divided like in former times at the end of the Second World War. And this was emotionally terrible for the inhabitants along the border on the France side and on the German side as well. But nevertheless, the border controls and hurdles and barriers that infected the commuters faced over the course of the pandemic and demonstrated for us how closely intertwined France and Germany's border regions are in terms of job. For example, the bakery in one of the divided villages is only on the German side and not on the France side, and the border were closed and it was controlled. So finding a bakery needs a 30-kilometer trip to do a shopping for a pancake or something else. We have schools, we have students on both sides. So we have along the border of France a lot of pupils and students who came every day to Germany, or Germans who go every day to France to visit the school. And everything was closed, and it was quite complicated. And this was while we have in Europe three classifying region in the pandemic side. So we have high risk zones, we have high incidence zones, and we have virus mutation areas along our borders. And especially in the last wave, the third wave, we have had a very complicated situation on the border France and Germany, France and Rhine-Palatinate. Well, the southern part of the region Grand Est was a high incidence zone, and the other along the border to the Département Moselle was a virus mutation area. And virus mutation area, that means there is no public transport possible. And so it was a total handicap for the pupils, for the jobs along the borders, and for all commuters. And that's why I say in future times, when we will organize or we will do we will plan how the future of cross-border cooperation is, we need a commitment how, or precisely defined how we will treat with these affected regions. What shall we do? I think it is clear that we will have no closed borders in the Schengen region, and that's very, very important for us. We need more coordination between the groups of experts, including the Robert Koch Institute, for example, and the French National Agency of Public Health, and the state-level agencies. It was a good start, but we recognized very soon that we have no database between the 3 or the 4 states. And so I think we need a shared databases. We need a common health data system. We need a database for intensive care capacities, hospitality, and the service sanitaire as well. And so I say that aligning measures across countries with the European Centre for Disease Control and Prevention would make collaboration easier, and we will all have a benefit from greater cooperation in these areas. Who will have the benefit? The patients in the border regions were remitted to hospitals in neighboring countries as needed. And yes, now we are better in digital formats like this, like video conferences were adopted quickly and facilitated direct contact between the regional and national authorities, how I mentioned. For example, every Thursday with the Federal Ministry of the Interior, the Federal Ministry of Health, and the Prefect and the French health authorities as well. And what we reached is exemptions, which we put in place for the commuters, so including lower testing requirements, a 24-hour rule, and exemptions of the digital, our DEA, the digital, Einreise-Ausnahmeverordnung. And it was what we have had was a greater awareness of the reality of everyday life in the Schengen area, and greater awareness, especially in Paris, the national government of France, and especially in Berlin, where the federal government of Germany is situated. The pandemic and the resulting restrictions and movement for daily commuters demonstrated this need. Of course, measures to prevent infection across borders are needed, but these measures should be transparent and mutually agreed upon. Even within Germany, we have seen that this is difficult to achieve at the federal level. But we are sure that we should make healthcare in less developed areas of the border region more accessible. In my hometown, for example, it is very near to the cross-border region of Luxembourg and France. We already have a solid foundation in emergency care and radiology, MRI. The establishment of a joint health center is complicated by the question of financing and the differences in payment, licensing, and technical system across countries. But it is possible. So we have such a healthcare cooperation also along the border to France and Belgium. So there is, we try to establish it in all our cross-border hospitals. In terms of infrastructure, it is also quite important, the public infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure. We have major projects such as a night train between Berlin and Paris, but another way we hopefully widely used. But in programs such as Connecting Europe facilities and Trans-European Networks transport, we have to cater to commuters' everyday needs. We need a reliable local rail line that does not require passengers to change trains at the border. So we will introducing in the Grand Est, that's our partner region in France, a prototype for this compatible rail car to the public on July the 10th, Coradia Polyvalent, and this is based, this easy base to use environmental sustainable model will be available to commuters on 7 lines starting in 2024, including Trier, Metz, and in Neustadt or Worth to Strasbourg. There are a wide range of exchange opportunities available to people in the border region, and we also need educational opportunities, including courses in the language of the neighbor countries. So it is quite important for us speaking French as well. So the dual degree programs, for example, the joint teaching degree offered in Mainz and Dijon on the University of the Greater Regions International Curriculum is such an example. Foundations like the Franco-German Citizens Fund support person-to-person exchanges, and platforms like the European Collection from our public broadcaster Arte facilitate digital exchange. And all these examples will show that the need is very high and that we work closer together after or in between the pandemic situation than before, and we have focused on our needs, and we will see a good future. And I say thank you very much to COTA for the resolution on cross-border cooperation. I think it is very useful to have these resolution, and it is a common sense for us to improve it. Thank you very much.
Hvala, gospe.
Thank you, Ms. Rab, for your presentation. And thank you for presenting the view from your region. Now moving on to Mr. Jari Nahkanen, who is the president of the CPMR and the Baltic Sea Commission. He is also the board member of the Council of Oulu region in Finland. Mr. Nahkanen, until now we've discussed mostly cooperation along land borders and land border regions in the EU, and the problems caused by the pandemic. But what is also important for our committee is the cooperation along sea borders. Could you explain what is your view of the future in this area as well? Mr. Nahkanen, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, dear members of the Committee of the Regions, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you for the invitation to join this important meeting. It's my pleasure to be among you today and represent CPMR to discuss the topic of the cross-border cooperation. Topic particularly dear to me. I come to Oulu region in Finland, and at the northernmost arm of the Baltic Sea. Regions that share a land border with Russia, but also that shares a maritime border with Sweden and with Estonia. Being coastal regions, CPM regions share maritime borders with other EU or non-EU regions. This topic is therefore crucial for us. EU maritime cross-border programs need to be kept and reinforced in the future. They deserve to be standalone programs. They have to be same value that the land cross-border program is. You remember well the attempt from the European Commission to include maritime cross-border programs in the transnational programs. CPM, together with the Committee of the Regions and other actors present today, opposed strongly to this change. Maritime cross-border programs, at the difference with transnational programs, are more adapted to small and new stakeholders joining cooperation projects, to people project, but also at the right scale new innovative policies. Maritime cross-border programs have a specific role to play to foster the green transition of Europe, but also to deliver the sustainable blue economy, one key priority of the European Commission. In light of the Green Deal agenda, maritime cross-border programs have been even more relevant than before. In the Baltic Sea region, they are the South Baltic and Central Baltic maritime cross-border programs, which have shown over the years the key added value for creating more integrated and development areas. Now we have also the Aurora Interreg program, being the only new Interreg program for post 2020. COVID-19, as we had heard, has brought back the negative impact of borders, including maritime borders. For example, borders between north of Sweden and Finland, where there the maritime connection between Ostrobothnia and Västerbotten through the ferry was hampered, having strong social and economic consequences. Now summer break is approaching, and Europeans want to travel and cross-border in safety. There is a strong need for coordination, clarity, and information to citizens also. The various challenges the EU is facing are going behind borders by nature and require, therefore a stronger cross-border cooperation. EU policies should have a stronger cross-border cooperation dimension, and that from the environment, climate, transport, to digital topics, to the recovery of Europe. The conference on the future of the Europe can be instrumental in achieving this. Another crucial issue is the role of the cross-border cooperation in the recovery of Europe. The CPMR welcomes that the Recovery and Resilience Facility regulation included the possibility for member states to plan and implement cross-border projects. However, according in a CPM analysis on the recovery plans, it seems the use of this possibility is quite limited, unfortunately. We will win the recovery of Europe not by individual performance, but by playing together. Cross-border areas require specific attention and multi-level cooperation. Regions have a key role to play. However, it's a joint effort from the level of governance, local, regional, national, and European. This is why the event organized today by the Committee of the Regions and Partners is timely organized. CPM welcomes the Committee of the Regions' key engagement, but also from the other stakeholders and organizations present today for promoting future cross-border cooperation in different aspects. We share many points raised in a core resolution. It would like to stress a few related messages. Firstly, the importance of preserving and reinforcement of maritime cross-border programmes. Secondly, CPM oppose any reduction of Interreg programmes in the future. Thirdly, cross-border cooperation, but more generally, cooperation requires more EU budget. Interreg programs had proved to be essential instrument, providing key impact on the ground. In a recent paper, the leading think tank Bruegel has found that CPSC project bring higher economic growth. Interreg is most probably after Erasmus the most known EU program. Still, it counts only for about 3% of the cohesion policy budget. CPMR, we are calling for future EU budget to Interreg between 5 to 8%. This increase should not be made at the expense of the allocation for the cohesion policy mainstream programs. This is a no zero sum game. CPMR will also underline the importance of facilitating cross-border cooperation with EU countries, such as Russia, Norway. At CPMR, we deeply regret that UK is not part of Interreg. For example, Scotland was part of Northern Periphery and Arctic Interreg program, which enable to close cooperation with Scotland. We support exploring alternative ways to deliver cross-border cooperation between EU and UK within the legal boundaries set by the trade agreements. Furthermore, we need to use more existing territorial bodies such as EGTC, your district, your regions, to facilitate future cross-border cooperation. I was delighted to hear presentation from the previous speakers about their key work. Since this year, there is a new EGTC, which is Kvarken Council, which plays a major role in fostering maritime cross-border cooperation between Österbotten in Finland and Västerbotten in Sweden. Both regions are part of EGTC, with other local actors. These cooperation struggles should be strongly supported by the EU, since they facilitated people to people, business to business, and more cooperation. A key importance for the successful cross-border cooperation is commitment of the national level. Member state needs to be fully engaged in that work. Lastly, cross-border cooperation can bring a key contribution to delivering the priorities of the macro-regional strategies. More alignment between cross-border and these strategies should be sought where possible. I will stop there with 3 messages for today, but also for the Conference of Europe. We need more cross-border cooperation, which implies more multi-level cooperation. We think the EU should set out a strategy based on 4 elements to turn the shot in a goal. We need adequate fundings for cooperation, adequate tools, legal instruments for cooperation, adequate governance, and 4th, and last but not least, we need committed people to drive the cooperation. So let's act local and behind borders, land and also maritime. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nahkanen, for his views on this matter, on cross-border cooperation. And now, Mr. Peter van Troek, who is coming from a province located at the Dutch-German border. He is the regional minister of Gelderland and also the vice president of the Association of European Border Regions. Mr. Troek, the Association of European Border Regions is the leading association in Europe, also in the political sphere. What has to be done, in your opinion, first of all, by 2025, and what will Europe be like in 2050? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zagar. Good morning, everyone, colleagues from the border regions. I'm going to speak Dutch.
Heel fijn dat
It's wonderful to be able to discuss the future of cross-border cooperation with you in the context of the discussion on the future of Europe. I won't keep you in suspense on the core of my message. There is no future for Europe if you don't have the possibility to live in cross-border regions, and I'm going to talk about some examples of cross-border living. One, open borders even times of crisis. The conference has talked about this a lot, and we can hear the lessons, and this is something that we've experienced also in the German-Dutch border regions. Open borders is very important for cross-border regions, also during crises. And so what I agree with the previous speakers who have raised this point. And so now I can move on to the second element, which is cross-border problems, which don't necessarily only require voluntary, but also compulsory cross-border cooperation. Let me just give you one example in terms of the flows under the Water Directive, and I think it will make this very clear. The policy in these regions may not so upstream regions should not cause problems for downstream regions. And so if cross-border citizens take this seriously, they will have to agree with their citizens, cross-border citizens, on these issues, and they should be able to make compulsory measures. And then also the barriers with regard to health. There is very intensive cooperation between the Netherlands and Noord-Rijn-Westfalen and Niedersachsen in this area. This cooperation makes it possible within the 24-hour region to have a task force set up for crisis management in Noord-Rijn-Westphalia and Niedersachsen with the Netherlands to deal with the COVID crisis. We're very pleased that the cross-border region on both sides has been able to work well and really deal with these issues and facilitate these issues. But we shouldn't wait for a next crisis. We need to start building cross-border cooperation and also recognize the differences in the regions, but also take advantage of cooperation so that next time there is a crisis, whatever that crisis may be, we will be able to manage it properly. And then there's a fourth issue that I would like to look at, and that is how you can deal with shortcomings. There were huge peaks in intensive care during the height of the crisis, and so we were able to tap into German capacity. But then that begs the question as to why we can't do this when there's no crisis. If there's some kind of a shortcoming, you should be able to deal with it in a cross-border way. And we are trying to work in Gelderland to reduce these shortcomings. And there shouldn't really be a disadvantage to living in cross-border regions. Quite the contrary, it should be an advantage that you can tap into two different systems, and that should be one of the advantages of living in a cross-border region. And this brings me to my fifth point, which is exchanging knowledge. Now, with respect for the cross-border cooperation, we can't work alone. Cross-border regions need to work together and need to take responsibilities together. And for this reason, through our new German strategy, we have shown our German partners how we are going to work in the coming 7 years. So we've looked at regional topics and topics which are of importance to the cross-border region. Through the Interreg program, we can work with our German partners on these focal points. Interreg Deutschland-Nederland is a big financial instrument to improve cross-border cooperation. And then there's a final element that I'd like to point out: work together. We're very happy with our cooperation with the MOT, with the CEBR, with the European Committee of the Regions, and as the AEBR, we are very keen on all of our cooperations, and the Committee of the Regions has made it very clear how cross-border cooperation plays a key role in development of these regions. And that is one of the advantages of being a member of the Association of European Border Regions. We can work together with other regions and look at different solutions that are taken in different areas so that we can work that into our solutions. And we have very close cooperation with the EU. And that's why the AEBR is very important for us, because it's a platform to work with other regions, look at different ways of solving cross-border issues. There are other solutions which are brought together under the aegis of the AEBR and helps us look at these issues together. So the ABR is going to be 50 years old. So that's a half a century of cooperation and putting energy into European values of freedom, equality, and democracy. And it's a very good opportunity to take a moment to look towards the future. And that's why the next annual Congress is using the topic Mirror to the Future. That's our slogan. And this is an inspiration for the future. And as Gelderland, we are going to be the host of the 50th ABR Congress on the 20th to the 21st of October. And the ABR was actually founded on the cross-border region between the Netherlands and Germany. So it's a very opposite celebration. During the annual Congress, we really want to take a look to the future. We're really at a crossroads. There are many transitions ahead, and the border regions can really give shape to these transitions. For example, the climate challenges that we're all facing. The European Commission has set up the Green Deal to give shape to this. And as a border region, we are really instrumental in bringing the Green Deal into practice. And that's why we are really taking a closer look at the Green Deal and how it works into border regions, for example, cross-border transport, cross-border energy provision. And that's why we would like to warmly invite you to participate on the 20th to the 21st of October. You can be present physically or virtually in the 50th Congress of the ABR in Arnhem in the Netherlands. So we're going to have workshops on the Green Deal so that we can look at how border regions and how working with the network organizations to make a difference. And so that is the date, save the date, the 20th to the 21st of October in Arnhem, so that we can take a look at how we can work together even beyond our immediate circles so that we can have a more sustainable and climate-friendly Europe. Thank you.
Hvala, gospodu.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hoek, for presenting the Dutch cross-border view. Now we've exhausted the list of participants, but we still have some time, very briefly, for some short comments or questions, perhaps. I am opening the debate. If any of the participants would like the floor, please go ahead, but very briefly, please, because we're running out of time.
Gospod Vilot.
Mr. Benoit Villot, please go ahead.
It doesn't seem that your mic is on. You would have to open your mic and press speak.
Gospod Benoit, speak.
Press the speak button.
Press the speak button, please.
I don't think he can. I propose continuing with some other speakers that might be interested.
Gospod Benoit, da ne dobijemo na linijo, še mogoče.
Okay, Mr. Benoit is not coming through. Anyone else, perhaps? Anyone else would like the floor?
Ni želja.
That does not seem to be the case. Anyone? We still have a few minutes.
Ja, če torej ni želja.
If nobody wants to discuss further, I would first of all like to thank everyone, all the participants in both panels, both parts of the discussion. During the first part, we focused on the problems and consequences of the COVID crisis, its effects on cross-border cooperation, and then during the second part, we focused on cross-border cooperation and the vision of the future. To sum up, all the contributions which we've heard today were very useful, very important, and they're also very useful for our future discussions on cross-border cooperation, and also for the measures which we'll have to adopt. Cross-border cooperation is extremely important. Cross-border regions are very important for various reasons. The development of these regions will also lead to development of the EU. Cross-border regions have numerous potentials in various areas. And they are facing also several obstacles, but they present a huge potential for development of the economy, for example, tourism, and also our cohabitation as such. Until the COVID hit, and also during the pandemic, several projects were being implemented and are being implemented that led to the strengthening of the development potential of these regions. I think we can all agree that the pandemic has caught us off guard at all levels. And it has shown several problems which we continue to face in cross-border cooperation. The crisis itself and the fact that, to a certain extent, life had been brought to a halt, and that this severely affected the exchange of information at a regional level. The fact that this has affected several sectors, several areas, that migrations, cross-border migrations have been brought to a halt, that this had severe social and economical consequences. So in addition to all that, the crisis has also shown that these cross-border regions are developed to different extents. Also for historical reasons. This has shown that we have to be prepared. We cannot wait for a new crisis to come and catch us off guard again. And also, we should strengthen our work on several areas. But we also need to deal with certain problems related to the centralization, for example, demographic trends, the geography, and so on. So we need to ensure more balanced development. We have to act, and our actions has to be based on cooperation. This is also evident from today's discussion. Cooperation on several areas. Economic, for example, but also in transport and communications. We have to tackle communications obstacles. And we should also not forget on healthcare. And last but not least, we have to also improve education and language learning. We are discussing cooperation, and there are some basic elements that are to a certain extent already present. For example, the principle of subsidiarity, but not only at the European level and the national level, but within the triangle of Europe, state and regional level. This is the only way to achieve results. We need to strengthen the management systems, ensure a bottom-up approach. And throughout these programs, of course, we have to improve the funding or the financing of the existing mechanisms that already exist. We also need a comprehensive approach within this functional framework. We should ensure free movement, and if this crisis were to persist, or in the case of a potential future crisis, we need to preserve free movement. So we need to ensure the flow of information, the exchange of information, and so on. The Committee of Regions has prepared a resolution which includes several proposals on how to move on, how to continue our work. And in a way, this resolution also explains how to participate in the discussions on the future of Europe, the conference on the future of Europe. I'm not talking about only Europe as a continent, but also overseas territories, for example. Through the conference on the future Europe, we need to reach these targets, and this is also my request to you. I hope you will all contribute so that we can re-establish cross-border cooperation, because cross-border cooperation can strengthen us, and in itself, cross-border cooperation should become one of the priorities of the EU. I am convinced that today's conference, and at this point I would also like to once again thank all the participants, and state that their messages will form part of our future discussions, our future work. And we should not only discuss these matters. I hope that the Commission will subsequently adopt appropriate measures, and that words will be turned into actions. This brings me to the end of today's conference. I would once again like to thank all the participants, and the speaker kindly asks the interpreters and all the technical staff that have helped us at the conference, and who have allowed us to reach a very wide-ranging audience in Europe. Thank you.